The barn was already gone by the time Caleb Shaw kicked through the door. Not gone as in damaged, not gone as in salvageable, gone as in 30 feet of flame roaring straight up into the Wyoming night sparks, spiraling like burning stars flung loose from heaven, the heat so fierce it peeled the skin on his forearms before he even crossed the threshold. Inside, smoke rolled thick as river mud. He could not see, could not breathe, could hear only the screaming of horses and the deep groaning crack of timber surrendering to fire. Then he saw the man, standing in the middle of the aisle between stalls, torch still in hand, grinning like he had just told himself the funniest joke in the world. "Nothing personal," the man said, and threw the torch into the last dry pile of hay. Caleb hit him before the words finished echoing. Both of them crashed through burning straw fists and elbows and the blind fury of a man who had already lost too much to lose anything more. The arsonist was bigger, meaner, fought dirty, caught Caleb in the ribs with his knee in the jaw with his elbow. But Caleb had 7 years of silence and 7 years of loss behind every punch, and when his fist connected the third time, the man went limp. Caleb scrambled up, lungs screaming, eyes streaming. Somewhere to his left, Josiah was hauling a panicked horse through the inferno, muscles straining against raw animal terror, bellowing words that were not really words at all, just sound and fury and refusal to quit. From the roof, a rifle shot cracked the night. Bryce, firing not at people but at sky warning shots to scatter the riders circling outside like wolves. And then there was Clara. She appeared through the smoke like something out of a fever dream, cloth wrapped around her face, 5 feet 3 inches of stubbornness, moving straight into the collapsing heart of the barn. She grabbed the last horse's halter. The animal reared. She held on. Caleb reached her just as the main beam overhead let out a sound like a ship breaking apart, and he wrapped his arms around her waist and threw them both backward through the door. The roof came down behind them. They hit the ground hard, rolling through ash and embers. The reflected fire danced in her blue eyes. And in that moment, lying in the dirt with the sky burning above them, Caleb Shaw knew with absolute certainty that he would never let this woman go. The arsonist staggered out through a gap in the wreckage clothes, smoking, and collapsed. Clara was on her feet before Caleb. She walked to the man, picked up the Winchester she had set down by the water trough before running into the burning barn, and pressed the muzzle to the back of his head. "Who sent you?" Not a question, a demand. The man's voice came out high and broken. "Briggs, Briggs paid for all of it. The fences, the cattle, the fire, everything. It was all Briggs." Behind them, voices. Walt Greer from the neighboring ranch still pulling on his boots. The Henderson family in their nightclothes. Emmett Prescott, for once in his life, not grinning. Alma Finch, 70 years old and carrying a shotgun like she had been born with it. 12 people heard that confession under the burning sky. But to understand how a 22-year-old woman who weighed less than 100 pounds came to stand with a rifle over a beaten man in the ashes of a Wyoming barn with 3 of the biggest men in the territory standing behind her. Not to protect her, but because she had told them where to stand, "You need to go back." 3 weeks earlier, to the stagecoach, to the moment everything began to change. If you want to see how that happened, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that button now and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know because stories like this one have a way of finding the people who need them most. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The stagecoach pulled into Elkhorn, Wyoming on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1874, trailing a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a curtain waiting to be drawn. The town was not much: a general store with a crooked porch, a saloon that smelled of tobacco and regret, a sheriff's office that had not seen fresh paint since the war, a church with a bell that rang on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays if the preacher was feeling ambitious. And at the edge of the single dirt road that passed for Main Street, 3 men stood waiting. They were identical. That was the first thing anyone noticed about the Shaw brothers, and it was the thing that never stopped being strange no matter how many years you lived in their shadow. Same height, 6 feet 6 inches, every one of them. Same broad shoulders, same sun-darkened skin, same jaw, same cheekbones, same eyes the color of aged bourbon, warm and sharp and holding light like autumn caught in amber. Triplets, born 38 years ago in a cabin that no longer existed to parents who no longer lived. Raised on this land, shaped by it, hardened by it, but identical only on the surface. Caleb Shaw stood in the center, the eldest by 11 minutes, though he carried himself like a man who had been old since birth. His face was the quietest of the three, the most still, the most carefully controlled. He was the one who made decisions, the one who signed papers, the one who had written the letter to the matrimonial agency 6 weeks ago in handwriting so precise it looked like it had been drawn rather than written. The letter had been specific. He needed a woman, not for love, not for companionship, for survival. Three men alone on a mountain ranch, 25 miles from town, could manage cattle, could mend fences, could shoe horses, and split wood and haul water. What they could not do was keep a household running while all three of them were in the field from before dawn until after dark. They needed someone to manage supplies, to cook, to keep records, to maintain the house while they maintained the land. He had been specific about what he wanted: plain, practical, accustomed to hard work. Someone who would not look at the isolation and the rough living and the endless labor and decide it was too much. Someone who would not leave. He had been very specific about that last part. Josiah Shaw stood to Caleb's left. He was the middle brother, which meant he was the loudest, the most volatile, the most likely to solve a problem with his fists before his brain had time to object. His hands were enormous, scarred from the forge where he spent half his days shaping iron into tools and horseshoes, and sometimes, when the mood took him, things of unexpected beauty, hinges with scrollwork, fireplace pokers with twisted handles. He was the heat of the family, the forge fire, the one who burned. Bryce Shaw stood to Caleb's right and slightly behind, as if he preferred to observe the world from a half-step removed. He was the youngest by 23 minutes, and he was the quietest human being most people in Elkhorn had ever encountered. Bryce did not speak when a nod would do, did not nod when a look would do, did not look when listening would do. He was a tracker, could read hoof prints in dust the way other men read newspapers, could tell you which direction the wind had blown 3 days ago by the lean of grass, could sit so still that birds landed on his hat. He was also, though no one in the family said it aloud, the one who saw things first. The stagecoach door opened, and everything Caleb Shaw had planned for the rest of his life collapsed like a barn in a windstorm. She stepped down carefully, one hand on the coach frame, one hand holding a small traveling bag. She was young, early 20s at most, petite in a way that made the three massive men in front of her look like they belonged to a different species entirely. Her dress was navy blue, fitted at the waist, dusty from 1,000 miles of travel, with small lace details at the collar and cuffs that spoke of quality worn down by real use. A cameo brooch sat at her throat. Her hair was honey blonde, partially pinned up in a modest style with soft strands that had escaped during the journey and now framed a face that did not belong in Elkhorn, Wyoming. It did not belong anywhere that looked like this: heart-shaped, porcelain fair, large blue eyes the color of cornflowers after rain set beneath long dark lashes, high cheekbones, a small straight nose, full lips that were naturally the color of rose petals, slightly parted as she took in the town, the mountains, the three men standing before her in the dirt. Josiah's hat fell out of his hand. He did not notice. His lips moved, forming words that were not quite sound. That cannot be her. But it was, and nothing in Elkhorn, Wyoming would ever be the same. Bryce forgot to breathe. Caleb felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been sealed shut for 7 years, and his first instinct was to seal it tighter, to wall it off, to look at this woman and see not beauty but danger, because he had learned in the hardest possible way what beauty meant. It meant leaving. Behind them, the town reacted like a single organism. Alma Finch, 70 years old and the self-appointed conscience of Elkhorn, let out a gasp loud enough to be heard in the next county. Lord have mercy, that girl is too pretty for ranch work. She will be on the next stage out. Mark my words. Emmett Prescott, the town's most persistent bachelor, let out a low whistle that made Josiah's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. Every man, woman, and child gathered at that station went quiet, then loud, then quiet again. And Clara Whitmore just stood there, not pleading, not smiling, not performing any of the things that pretty women were expected to perform when arriving somewhere new. She was looking at them, at the three identical men, measuring, assessing. Her eyes moved from face to face, and there was something in that gaze that was not soft at all. Which one of you is Caleb Shaw? She said it like a statement, Her voice was low, steady, tired maybe from the journey but not uncertain. Not even slightly. Caleb stepped forward. I am. I am Clara Whitmore. I can see that. She tilted her head, just slightly. Can you? It was not a question. It was a challenge. And Caleb, who had not been challenged by anything other than weather and cattle and the slow erosion of hope for 7 years, did not know what to do with it. Alma Finch's voice cut through the murmuring crowd behind them, pitched to Carrie. That girl will not last a week. Too delicate, too refined. Those hands have never touched a fence post. Something moved across Clara's face. Not anger, something colder, something that had edges. I did not travel 1,000 miles to be judged at first sight, she said, still looking at Caleb, still quiet. But if that is what is happening here, I would like to know now. Caleb's throat felt like he had swallowed sand. The letter said you were... I know what the letter said. She stepped closer. Not to intimidate. There was nothing intimidating about a woman who barely reached his chest. But the closing of distance was deliberate, and it shifted something in the air between them. Plain, practical, accustomed to hard work. Nothing about beauty or the lack of it. The agency asked if I could survive frontier life. I said yes, because it is true. She paused. Her eyes held his without flinching. If you are standing here thinking I lied to you, you are wrong. If you are standing here wishing I looked different, that is your problem, not mine. Every word landed like a hammer on iron. Josiah made a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief, not mocking, surprised, like he had just heard something he did not know women were allowed to say out loud. Bryce, standing a half step behind his brothers, was not looking at Clara's face. He was looking at her hands, at the calluses on her palms, at the short, clean nails, at the small scars near her knuckles. That came from real work, not decoration. He noted these things the way he noted hoof prints and weather patterns quietly, completely, and filed them away without a word. Emmett Prescott chose that moment to swagger over, hat tipped back, grin stretched wide. Well now, seems like the Shaw boys got themselves quite a... Walk away. Caleb's voice came out flat and cold and final. The grin faltered. Just being friendly. Walk away. Emmett retreated, but the damage was already done. Every bachelor in Elkhorn was calculating. Every married woman was shaking her head. And Clara Whitmore stood in the center of it all with her dusty dress and her cornflower eyes and her absolute refusal to beg for acceptance. Your trunk is on top of the coach, Caleb said. I will get it. I can carry my own. I'm sure you can. He moved past her, felt her eyes follow him, felt everyone's eyes follow him. His hands were shaking when he reached for the trunk, and he hated himself for it. The trunk was heavier than he expected. Well made, solid, not fancy but built to last. Same as the coat she wore. Good quality used hard, not for show. When he turned back, she had already climbed onto the wagon seat. Josiah stood nearby, hat retrieved from the dirt mouth, still slightly open. Bryce had silently moved to tie his horse to the back of the wagon. Clara looked at the sun. The agency said the ranch is 25 miles from town. It is already past noon. We should go. For one strange moment, nobody moved. The entire town of Elkhorn watched as Caleb Shaw secured the trunk. In the wagon bed, climbed up beside the most beautiful woman any of them had ever seen and took the reins. They rolled away in a silence so thick you could have cut it with a dull blade. They were 3 miles out before anyone spoke. You are disappointed. Clara said it without turning her head. Not a question. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail. I asked for someone who would not leave. And you think I will. I think beautiful women always do. The silence that followed was different, heavier, loaded with something that had teeth. I see. Her voice changed. Still quiet, but there was an edge beneath it now sharp enough to draw blood. So you have decided my future based on my face. I have decided my future based on experience. Then let me offer you some of mine. She shifted on the seat to face him directly. All 5 feet 3 of her turned toward all 6.5 feet of him, and somehow impossibly she did not seem small. I have spent 22 years watching men make assumptions about what I can and cannot do, about what I am worth, about where I belong. Her chin lifted. I took this offer because the agency promised a partnership on a working ranch. Not promises of love, not a husband who would worship me, just honest work and a fair chance. Behind them on his horse, Bryce listened to every word. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted the way light shifts on water when the wind changes direction. If you cannot offer that because you are too busy expecting me to run, Clara continued, then turn this wagon around right now. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles went white. And if I do not turn it around, then give me 1 month. That made him look at her. What? 1 month to prove I can handle ranch life. If I fail, I leave without complaint. If I succeed, we decide our future as equals. No assumptions, no judgments based on the past. Just what is real between us. Everything inside Caleb screamed no. Screamed that getting attached to someone this beautiful, this articulate, this unexpected would end the same way everything else had ended. In loss. In the hollow ache he had carried since Della walked out 7 years ago, looked at the life he had built, and said 5 words that still echoed in his sleep. I cannot live like this. But something in Clara Whitmore's eyes, some impossible combination of exhaustion and determination and absolute refusal to beg, made him hesitate. 1 month, he heard himself say. 1 month, she agreed. They shook on it. Her hand was calloused and strong in his, and small enough that his fingers closed around it entirely. For one beat, neither of them let go. Josiah, riding just behind the wagon, watched that handshake and felt something he had not felt in years. Something reckless and warm that he did not trust and could not name. Bryce watched it too. From his horse at the rear, where he always rode a half step removed from the world, observing what others missed. He saw the way Clara's fingers did not tremble, not even slightly. She was a woman accustomed to staking everything on a handshake, and that told him more than any letter from any agency ever could. The ranch appeared as the sun began its long descent toward the mountains. Caleb watched Clara's face the way a man watches the sky for storm signs, searching for disappointment, for second thoughts, for the moment when reality crushes whatever picture she had painted in her mind. Instead, she leaned forward, studying the land. Those cattle in the north pasture, she said. Caleb blinked. Josiah, who had been half dozing on his horse, sat up straight. They are too close to the creek. If you get heavy rain, that creek floods. Those animals will be trapped against the slope. She pointed. See how the ground is soft there. That is not recent rain. That is constant seepage from underground. You need to move them higher. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. Then Josiah let out a breath that was almost a laugh. How in the hell do you know that? Clara did not look at him. She was still studying the land eyes moving across the terrain with the focus of a general surveying a battlefield. My father ran freight routes through 3 territories. I learned to read land before I could read books. Bryce, behind them all, allowed himself the smallest possible nod. He had seen it at the stagecoach station. The calluses, the practical nails, the way her eyes assessed terrain. He had known then. This woman was not what anyone in Elkhorn expected. But even Bryce had not expected this. The house was small. 2 main rooms and 3 bedrooms that were really just partitioned spaces barely big enough for a bed and a chest. Caleb had spent the last week trying to make it presentable, but standing there while Clara looked around, every crack and worn board screamed poverty. I will sleep in the barn, Caleb said. Josiah and Bryce can share, and you can... No, Clara set down her traveling bag. I will take the storage room beside the kitchen. You 3 keep your rooms. I did not come here to displace anyone. She looked around the house one more time, not with disappointment, not with dismay, with the careful, calculating eye of someone already planning improvements. Is there work to do before dark? There was always work to do before dark. And this is where what Caleb expected and what actually happened diverged so far apart they might as well have been different stories. He expected her to struggle, expected her to slow them down, to need constant instruction, to maybe last one day before admitting this life was too hard. Clara Whitmore worked like she had been born on a ranch. She fed the horses without being told how, checked their hooves with competent hands, asked intelligent questions about the feed schedule and water supply that showed she already understood the answers and was testing whether they did. When a fence rail needed repair near the barn, she was reaching for the hammer before Caleb could. Josiah watched her drive a nail straight and true on the first swing and said very quietly to no one in particular, "What in God's name did that agency send us?" By the third day, she had reorganized the barn storage so efficiently that Bryce, who was particular about order, in a way his brothers found maddening, found things twice as fast. He said nothing about this, but he stopped rearranging things behind her, which from Bryce was the highest compliment a human being could receive. By the fifth day, she had identified a leak in the feed shed roof that all three brothers had been too busy to notice. By the seventh day, she was working beside them like they had been partners for years instead of days. And she never once complained. Not about the early mornings, not about the physical labor, not about the primitive accommodations, not about the simple food, not about the isolation that had driven Della away 7 years ago. Instead, she asked questions, relentless, pointed, revealing questions. Why do you not rotate the cattle between pastures? Do not have enough pasture, Caleb said. You have 700 acres and only use 400. We tell him, the north section is too rough. Cannot get cattle up there. Did you try? Silence. Then how do you know? By the end of that first week, they had walked every acre of Shaw land, all four of them. Clara carried her notebook everywhere, sketching rough maps, making calculations, asking questions that had no easy answers. She pointed out water sources that Caleb had forgotten existed, noted where grass grew thicker, identified natural windbreaks that could shelter animals through the worst winter storms. Bryce walked beside her during these surveys, not because anyone asked him to, because she covered ground the way he did, slowly, attentively, reading the land like scripture. He had never met another person who moved through terrain the way he did, and the experience was strange and unsettling and not entirely unpleasant. One evening after a day that had started before dawn and ended well after dusk, Clara spread her papers across the rough kitchen table. Caleb sat across from her. Josiah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, listening. Bryce took the chair beside Clara and leaned in to study her maps. You could run 100 more head if you use the land right, she said, tracing lines with her pencil. The north section is rough, yes, but there are natural corridors, water access at 3 points, grass that has been growing untouched for years. She looked up. In 2 years, if we build it properly. She stopped. The word hung in the air. We. She had said we. Josiah was the first to move. Without a word, without anyone asking, he reached for the coffee pot and poured Clara a cup, set it down beside her papers. A small gesture. But Caleb saw it and something in his chest shifted, like a bone that had healed crooked, beginning to straighten. The month is not over, Caleb said quietly. No. Clara closed the notebook. It is not. That night, lying in his room staring at the ceiling he had stared at for 7 years, Caleb Shaw realized something had changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, just shifted. He still expected her to leave. But for the first time since Della walked out that door, some small, stubborn part of him hoped she would stay. He did not trust that hope, not yet, but it was there, and he could not make it go away. What Caleb did not know, what none of them knew, was that the hope was the most dangerous thing of all. Not because it was false, but because someone else had noticed it. Someone 10 miles away in the biggest house in the valley, sitting behind an oak desk reading a report from a man named Levi Cobb. The report said the Shaw brothers had a new woman on the ranch, young, beautiful, capable. Harlan Briggs read it twice, then folded it, then looked out his window toward the creek that ran through Shaw land. The creek that controlled water access for the entire North Valley. The creek that Briggs needed if he was ever going to expand his herd past the mountains and into the territory he had been planning to own for the last 3 years. That creek is mine, Briggs said. His voice was calm, pleasant even. The voice of a man who had never needed to shout because the world had always rearranged itself around his wishes. On his desk, half hidden beneath the report, lay a letter bearing the seal of the territorial court. The addressee line read, Judge Albert Redmond. Cobb saw it. Cobb did not ask about it. There were questions you did not ask on the Briggs ranch. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. The woman, Briggs said, is she staying? Seems like it. She is working the ranch like she was born to it. Briggs tapped the desk once. That is unfortunate. He did not say for whom. Back at the Shaw Ranch, the second week began with a discovery that would change everything. Bryce came back late from checking the eastern fence line. His face, always quiet, was quieter than usual, which if you knew Bryce Shaw meant something was very wrong. Fences cut, he said. 4 places, wire cut with tools, not weather, not animals. Caleb and Josiah exchanged a look. This had been happening intermittently for months. Stray cuts here and there. Easy to blame on wear and tear, on drifters, on bad luck. But the frequency was increasing. And Bryce did not say things without reason. Clara looked up from the ledger she had been working on. She had taken over the ranch's financial records on day 3 after discovering that Caleb's system of accounting consisted of a cigar box full of crumpled receipts and the general philosophy of spending less than you earned and hoping for the best. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. "Few months," Caleb said. The tone in his voice was clear. "This is not your concern." Clara heard the tone, ignored it completely. "Are the cuts consistent? Same tool pattern? Same type of wire separation?" Bryce looked at her. For the first time since her arrival, his gaze held something beyond quiet observation. There was curiosity in it, real curiosity. The kind he usually reserved for unusual animal tracks or weather patterns that did not fit the season. "I have not compared them," he admitted. "You should. If the same tool made the same cuts in the same pattern, this is not random. It is systematic. Someone is applying pressure to this ranch." She opened her notebook to a fresh page. "I will start documenting every incident from today forward. Dates, locations, cut patterns, any tracks or evidence nearby." Caleb opened his mouth to say something. Probably something about how she did not need to get involved. Probably something protective and well-meaning and exactly wrong. Bryce spoke first. "Good idea." 2 words. From the man who rationed words like a miser rationed gold. Caleb looked at his youngest brother and saw something he had not seen in Bryce's face in a long time. Interest. Not just in the problem, in the person who had identified it. Clara did not seem to notice. She was already writing her pencil, moving in the quick, precise strokes of someone who had been keeping records since before she was old enough to understand what they meant. But Bryce noticed everything. And what he noticed now, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, while his 2 brothers processed the implications of cut fences, and a woman who thought like a detective, was this: Clara Whitmore had been cataloging the fence damage since day 2. She had been watching, counting, comparing. She had known something was wrong before any of them had told her, because she read land the way he did, and land always told the truth. The question was whether the truth it told would keep them alive. 2 days later, Clara and Bryce were checking the northern fence line when Bryce stopped walking. The motion was so sudden and so still that Clara, who was 3 steps ahead, felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She turned. Bryce's eyes were fixed on the tree line above them. His hand moved to Clara's arm. Light, brief, just enough pressure to say stop. "Someone watching," he said, barely above a whisper. "From the ridge, 2 days now." Clara felt the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Instead, she followed his gaze to the tree line and assessed. "They are measuring our response," she said, "seeing if we notice, seeing how afraid we are." Bryce looked down at her, and for the first time since the stagecoach, his expression held something that was not observation, something warmer, something that moved beneath the surface of his stillness, like a current beneath ice. "You are not afraid," and he said. "Not a question." "I did not say I was not afraid. I said I do not show it to men like that. There is a difference, Bryce." Bryce nodded slowly. His hand was still on her arm. "Yes," he said, "there is." They stood like that for a moment. 2 people on a mountainside watched by eyes they could not see, sharing a silence that said more than most conversations. Then Clara turned and began walking again, and Bryce fell into step beside her, and neither of them mentioned the hand on the arm or the warmth it had left behind. But that evening, when they reached the house and Caleb looked up from his work, Clara saw something in his eyes that told her the ground had shifted again. Not between her and Bryce, between her and all of them. She was no longer a guest, no longer a stranger being tested. She was becoming part of this place. And somewhere on the ridge above the north pasture, someone was watching. Someone who had reported back to a man behind an oak desk who had read the report and tapped his finger once against the wood and said in that calm and pleasant voice that never needed to shout, "Interesting." She is making them stronger. A pause. We will need to fix that. Now let me ask you something. If you were Caleb Shaw in this moment, a man who had already lost everything once watching this 22-year-old woman write in her notebook about enemies she had not yet met, what would you do? Would you warn her away? Would you tell her to take the next stagecoach back to wherever she came from, where it was safe, where no one cut fences in the dark or watched from ridgelines? Or would you hope, even knowing what hope had cost you before, that this time might be different? That this woman who read land like scripture and drove nails straight and carried herself like she had been fighting her whole life might be exactly what she appeared to be. Someone who would not leave. Stay with me. Because what happened next in the days that followed tested everything Caleb Shaw believed about trust, about strength, and about the kind of woman who steps off a stagecoach in a dusty frontier town and refuses to become anything other than exactly who she is. And it started with 3 riders on the horizon moving with the casual arrogance of men who believed that numbers made them right. Day 9 began with silence and ended with gunpowder. Caleb was checking the eastern fence line, riding slow, studying the cuts Bryce had found, trying to see the pattern Clara kept insisting was there. Josiah was in the forge behind the barn, hammering a new set of hinges, the rhythmic clang of iron on iron, carrying across the still morning air like a heartbeat. Bryce had ridden to town for wire and nails and salt, which left Clara alone at the ranch for the first time since she had arrived. She was not alone for long. She saw them from the kitchen window when they crested the ridge a half-mile out. 3 riders, moving in no particular hurry, spread in a loose formation that said they were not worried about what they would find because they already knew the answer. 2 of the Shaw brothers were gone. One was in the forge with his back turned and a hammer in his hand, and the woman was alone in the house. Clara set down the ledger she had been working on, walked to the back door, took the Winchester from the rack beside the frame, the one Bryce kept loaded and oiled and positioned where a hand could find it in the dark. She checked the chamber. Full. She stepped onto the porch. The lead rider was a man named Levi Cobb. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough, along with the names of his children and the fears of his wife and the exact shape of the noose that was tightening around his neck. But in this moment, he was just a man on a horse with a grin that showed too many teeth, flanked by 2 others who sat their saddles with the loose confidence of men accustomed to being on the winning side of unfair odds. "Heard the Shaw boys got themselves a new bride," Cobb called out. "Came to say hello." Clara stood on the porch with the Winchester resting across her forearms. Not aimed, not threatening, just present, the way a rattlesnake is present when you notice it coiled beside the trail. "You are on private land without an invitation." The grin flickered. "Just being neighborly, ma'am. You rode onto private property without permission to observe and intimidate. I would call that several things. Neighborly is not one of them." She came down the porch steps, each step deliberate, measured. The Winchester never moved from its resting position across her arms, but her right index finger lay along the receiver, not on the trigger, not yet, but close enough that a man who understood guns would understand the distance between where that finger was and where it could be in a quarter second. Cobb understood guns. His grin died. "Furthermore," Clara continued, her voice carrying the flat calm of someone reading aloud from a legal document, "I have collected fabric samples snagged on barbed wire at 3 separate fence breaks over the past week. The compression pattern on the wire cuts is identical at all 3 sites, which means the same tool was used. And your companion on the left is wearing a glove with a torn seam that matches a piece of fabric I recovered from the north break 4 days ago." The man on the left looked down at his glove, then looked at Cobb. Then, with the slow horror of a man who has just realized he brought a knife to an artillery fight, tucked his hand behind his back. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the creek running a quarter-mile away. Then hoofbeats, hard and fast from the east. Caleb riding at full gallop, face carved from granite, his pistol already in his hand. And from the forge, Josiah emerging through the wide doors with a 6-pound hammer in his fist and murder in his eyes. Cobb looked left, Clara with the Winchester, looked right, Caleb with the pistol closing fast, looked behind, Josiah with the hammer already moving to flank. 3 against 3. Except one side had a woman who could read forensic evidence from barbed wire, and 2 men who looked like they had been built to pull mountains out of the ground. "Tell your employer Clara said before anyone else could speak, that if he wants to intimidate small ranchers, he should come himself instead of sending boys to do a man's work. 5 seconds. Nobody breathed. Then Cobb jerked his reins, wheeled his horse, and rode hard for the ridge. His companions followed. All three disappeared over the crest without looking back. Clara waited until the dust settled. Then she lowered the Winchester and turned to face Caleb, who had dismounted and was walking toward her with an expression she could not quite read. Anger, maybe, or something closer to awe. "You know how to use that," he said. "Yes." "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough." Josiah arrived breathing hard, the hammer still in his hand. He looked at Clara, then at the ridge where three riders had vanished, then at Clara again. And something shifted in his face, something fundamental, like a wall coming down that had been standing so long he had forgotten it was there. "How long have you been collecting evidence?" he asked. "Since day 2. Josiah let out a breath, set the hammer down on the porch rail, looked at his brother. "Caleb," he said, "what the hell did that agency send us?" It was not really a question. And Caleb, looking at the small woman standing in the afternoon light with a Winchester in her steady hands, did not have an answer. What the agency had sent them was not what he had asked for. It was not plain. It was not simple. It was not safe. It was something he had not known he needed until it was standing in front of him, refusing to be anything other than what it was. That evening, after the chores were done and the horses were checked and the doors were locked, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Caleb. Josiah had gone to his room, the adrenaline finally draining out of him, leaving exhaustion behind. Bryce had returned from town, heard the full account from Josiah, delivered at considerable volume and with creative profanity, and taken up his usual position on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Watching the darkness, Clara and Caleb sat across from each other in the lamplight. She had her notebook open. He had his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he was not drinking from. "You should have told me about the fences," she said, "about the pattern, about whoever is behind it. I did not know you would care. I have been cataloging fence damage since day 2, Caleb. The pattern is obvious. Someone is trying to pressure you off this land." He stared at her, at the careful handwriting in her notebook, at the maps she had drawn, at the timeline of incidents laid out in neat columns that turned random misfortune into something deliberate and strategic and terrifying. "His name is Harlan Briggs," Caleb said finally. "Owns the biggest spread in the valley. Has for 15 years. He wants the water access. Shadow Creek runs through our land. Without it, his herd cannot expand north. With it, he controls everything." Clara wrote the name down, underlined it twice. "Tell me about him." Caleb told her what he knew, that Briggs was respected in town, that he donated to the church, that he sat in the front pew on Sundays and tipped his hat to women and bought drinks for men whose opinions he needed, that he had friends in the territorial government, connections in the railroad companies, and a patience that made him more dangerous than any outlaw because outlaws acted on impulse and Briggs acted on strategy. "Men like him do not just want success," Clara said when Caleb finished. "They want control, total control, and they will crush anyone who stands in the way." "How do you know that?" "Because my father dealt with men like Briggs on every major route." Her voice did not change, but something behind her eyes went distant. "They build empires on other people's silence." "Your father, you said he ran freight routes." "Yes." "What happened to him?" Clara's pencil stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside and the creak of the porch where Bryce sat keeping watch. "He died last year," she said. "On the trail. They said it was an accident." The pencil resumed, pressing harder than before. "But someone wanted his roots, and he would not sell." She did not say more. Did not need to. Caleb heard what lived between the words, the grief, the fury, the suspicion that ate at her in the dark hours, the certainty that her father had been killed, and the helplessness of not being able to prove it. "That is why you came here," he said quietly. "I came here because after he died, his business partner looked at me and saw a payout, not a person. I sold the business to protect the men who worked for us. 2 weeks later, the agency's letter arrived." She looked up. "A place where work mattered more than appearances seemed like exactly what I needed." The lamplight caught those blue eyes, blue as grief, blue as steel. "I am 22 years old," she said, and her voice held no self-pity, only fact. And no one has ever kissed me. Not because I am ugly, because on freight roads, the girl who lets men get close is the girl who loses everything. The words settled between them like snow. Caleb reached across the table, slowly, palm up, an offering, not a demand. His hand lay there on the rough wood, big and scarred and trembling slightly. Clara looked at it, at the calluses, at the old rope burns, at the way his fingers shook with something that was not weakness, but the effort of a man trying to be gentle after years of having nothing to be gentle toward. She placed her hand in his, small, calloused in its own way, warm. They sat like that, in the lamplight, in the silence, with the wind blowing outside and Bryce on the porch and Josiah sleeping, in the whole dark wilderness of Wyoming pressing against the walls. No kiss, no promises, just two hands holding on in the dark. And in the doorway to the hall, a shadow moved. Josiah, who had not been sleeping after all. He stood there for 3 seconds, watching his brother hold a woman's hand across a kitchen table, and something in his face softened into an expression that his brothers had not seen in years. Something that looked, if you caught it in the right light, like hope. He turned away without a sound. Let them have the moment. It was the first quiet thing Josiah Shaw had done in a long time, and it cost him more than anyone would ever know. 3 days later, 20 head of cattle vanished from the north pasture. Caleb found the gap at dawn. Wire cut clean, posts pulled loose. Tracks leading straight toward Briggs Land, not even bothering to hide direction. This was not theft disguised as bad luck. This was a message. Josiah wanted blood. He stood in the yard, fists clenched, so tight the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables, his face the color of a man holding back an explosion. We know where they are. We ride in. We take them back. Clara blocked the doorway. The image was almost absurd. A woman barely reaching his chest, standing between a wall of fury and the open yard. Her arms were not crossed. Her jaw was not set. She simply stood there, calm and immovable, the way a stone stands in a river. That is exactly what they want, she said. They want you angry. They want you stupid. They want you riding onto Briggs Land alone so it becomes your word against theirs, and you are the one who looks like the aggressor. So we just let them steal from us. Josiah's voice was barely controlled. No, we outsmart them. She looked at Caleb, who had come up behind Josiah and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, not to restrain, just to be there. We ride to town first, file a formal complaint with Sheriff Hadley, get it on record, then we track the cattle with a lawman as witness. Hadley will not help, Caleb said. He is afraid of Briggs. Maybe, but he is more afraid of looking corrupt when territorial judges start asking questions. Clara's eyes were steady. Trust me on this. Trust. That word again. The word Caleb had been running from for 7 years. He looked at Josiah, looked at Clara, looked at the tracks leading north across his land, straight and arrogant, left by men who believed they were untouchable. All right, he said. We do it your way. Sheriff Virgil Hadley sat behind his desk like a man waiting for a building to fall on him. When 4 people walked through his door, his face confirmed that the building had arrived. Clara led the conversation. Not because Caleb could not speak, not because Josiah was not intimidating enough, because Clara Whitmore could lay out facts with the precision of a lawyer, in the calm of a surgeon, and when she spoke, even men who did not want to listen found themselves unable to look away. 20 head of cattle stolen, wire cut with tools, posts pulled by hand, trail leads one direction. Hadley shifted in his chair. That is a serious accusation, miss. It is a serious crime, Sheriff, which is why we are here. You got proof Briggs did this. I have proof someone did it, and the trail leads to his land. Ride with us. See the evidence yourself. Document the tracks. If the trail leads somewhere else, fine. But if it leads to Briggs' cattle pens, you will have proof you witnessed personally. Hadley's eyes narrowed. You are that mail order bride. Clara did not blink. I am Caleb Shaw's partner, and I am asking you to do your job. The temperature in the room dropped. Josiah, standing behind Clara, felt his respect for this woman tick up another notch on a scale that was already running out of room. Hadley grabbed his hat. Fine, let us go look at tracks. But if this is some scheme to harass Harlan Briggs, there will be consequences. The only consequence I want, Clara said, is the return of stolen property. They rode out, Hadley complaining every mile, but when they reached the fence line and he saw the cuts, saw the pulled posts, saw the trail leading north as clear and deliberate as a painted line, his complaints stopped. That is deliberate, he admitted, crouching by the tracks. Professional work, not some drifter looking for quick money. No, Clara agreed. Someone who knows exactly what he is doing and does not care about being subtle. They followed the trail for 2 hours. It led exactly where Clara predicted, into a maze of arroyos and blind canyons on the edge of Briggs Range. The kind of place where you could hide cattle for weeks while changing brands. The kind of place where you could also ambush someone who came looking for them. Bryce saw it first. He always did. His hand went up, stopping them on a ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. Below, cattle milled in a makeshift pen. Two men stood guard with sidearms on their hips and the wary posture of men who expected trouble. There is a third man, Bryce said quietly, in the rocks to the left, watching the trail we just came in on. Clara nodded. She had already spotted him. This is a trap, she said. They wanted you to follow, wanted you to come riding in so they could claim self-defense. Hadley shifted uncomfortably on his horse. Now hold on, we do not know. Yes, we do, Clara pointed. Two guards positioned with clear sight lines. A third man concealed with a rifle covering the only approach. The cattle have not been rebranded, which means they are bait, not stolen goods. This entire setup is designed to kill whoever comes looking and call it justified. Caleb's blood ran cold. She was right. If they had come without Hadley, if Josiah had ridden in alone the way he wanted to, he would be dead in that canyon right now. So what do we do? Hadley asked. And the fact that he was asking her, this young woman in a dusty blue dress, instead of making his own decision, told Caleb everything he needed to know about the sheriff's spine. You do your job, Clara said. Ride down there with your badge visible. Inform them you are investigating stolen cattle. If they run that as evidence, if they fire on a lawman, that is attempted murder. Either way, you have grounds. If they simply deny knowledge, you note that the brands have not been changed, document their location, and inform them you will return with a warrant. She paused. Make them nervous. Nervous men rush their next move. Rushing creates mistakes. Hadley looked at Caleb. Your woman has a head for tactics. She is not my wife yet, Caleb said. The words came out automatically, and he regretted them instantly. Clara's face did not change, but something in her eyes flickered, a small light dimming by 1 degree, and Caleb felt it like a knife between his ribs. Hadley, oblivious to what had just happened, gathered his reins. Well, let us get this done. The confrontation went exactly as Clara predicted. The guards denied everything, claimed they were holding strays, got increasingly nervous when Hadley noted the brands matched Shaw's registry, made increasingly stupid statements about their rights and their boss's patience. Hadley documented everything, warned them not to move the cattle, rode out. On the ride back, Caleb waited for Clara to say something about the comment. She did not. She rode between him and Bryce in silence, her face composed, her notebook already out writing as she rode. But halfway home, she spoke. You need to decide something. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail. What is that? Whether you are preparing for me to leave or preparing for me to stay. Because you cannot do both. The bluntness hit like a fist to the chest. Every time we make progress, she continued, not looking at him. Every time we work well together, I see you pull back, reminding yourself not to get attached, not to trust it. She paused. You meant what you said back there. I did not mean, yes, you did. And you are right. I am not your wife. We made a deal, 1 month. But Caleb, we are 2 weeks in and you are still standing at that stagecoach station, convinced I am going to disappoint you. His throat felt tight. Everyone else did. I am not everyone else. Her voice softened, but only slightly. I am the woman who has been working beside you for 14 days, who knows your land better than you do, who just saved you from riding into an ambush. At what point does what I do matter more than what you fear? He had no answer. The silence stretched between them for miles. Bryce, riding behind them, heard every word and said nothing. But his hands tightened on his reins, and his jaw worked once, twice, like a man biting back something he did not have the right to say. When they reached the ranch, Caleb expected Clara to retreat, to put distance between them the way he had put distance with his careless words. Instead, she grabbed a lantern and headed for the barn. "What are you doing?" Caleb called. "Checking inventory. We are running low on winter feed, and we need to calculate exactly how much we will need for the remaining herd." "Clara, not now." She did not look back. "I am angry and I work better when I am angry. So I am going to work." Caleb stood in the yard hating himself, watching lamplight spill from the barn like something alive. An hour later, he found her in the hayloft, sitting cross-legged, surrounded by papers, calculations covering every surface. She looked up when he appeared, and her eyes were fierce but not closed, angry but not gone. "We cannot afford to lose more cattle," she said without preamble. "With the 20 gone, we are barely above survival level for winter. If Briggs takes another batch, or if we lose any to weather or disease, we will be forced to sell." "I know," which is exactly what he wants. Drive you into debt, force you to sell cheap. He swoops in with a cash offer. "I know, but there is another option." Caleb waited. "We prove he is systematically targeting small ranchers. Build a legal case that goes beyond one complaint to one sheriff. Something big enough that territorial authorities have to act." "How?" "By documenting everything. Every fence cut, every missing head, every threat, and by talking to other ranchers." She looked up. "We cannot be the only ones he is pressuring." It made sense. Brutal, exhausting, possibly fatal sense. "That could take months," Caleb said. "We have time." "Your month is half over." "That means I have 2 more weeks to prove I can handle ranch life." She met his eyes. "And if I succeed, we will have time to fight properly." "And if you do not succeed," Clara held his gaze, "do you actually think I am going to fail?" No, he did not anymore. "I think," he said carefully, "I am still learning how to hope again." Something in her expression softened, just at the edges, just enough. "Then learn faster," she said, "because I am not going anywhere. Not because of hard work, not because of danger, and definitely not because you are afraid to trust what is right in front of you." The next morning, Clara and Bryce rode to the nearest neighboring ranch. Clara wanted to start with Walt Greer, the old sheep rancher to the west, because Bryce said he was honest and afraid honest men were the most useful allies because they wanted to stop being afraid. Walt Greer was 65 years old. His fence line looked like Swiss cheese. When Clara asked about the cuts, about the missing livestock, about the accidents that seemed to happen only when it was most inconvenient, the old man sat down on his porch steps and cried. 2 months. He had been dealing with this for 2 months, alone, thinking he was just unlucky, thinking he was just old. Clara knelt beside him and put her hand on his arm, and the gesture was so natural, so unforced, that Bryce, watching from beside the horses, felt something move inside his chest that he could not name and did not try to. "You are not unlucky," Clara told Walt. "You are not old. You are being targeted, and you are not alone." She spent 2 hours sorting through Walt's records. Scattered notes, rough tallies, angry scribbles on loose paper. She organized them into chronological order. Cross-referenced dates with incidents at the Shaw Ranch. The pattern emerged like a face surfacing in dark water. "He hits different ranches in rotation," Clara said, spreading papers across Walt's kitchen table. "Never the same place twice in a row. It looks random. It looks like bad luck. But it is not random. It is strategic. He is wearing everyone down simultaneously so no one has the strength or resources to fight back." Walt stared at the papers, at the timeline, at the truth laid out in neat columns by a young woman who had been in the valley less than 3 weeks. "How many others?" he asked. "Based on your notes and what I have heard in town, at least 5. And if they are all experiencing the same pattern, they all have the same evidence." Clara looked up. "Combined, that is a federal case." "Federal." Walt's eyebrows climbed. "If we can prove systematic intimidation across multiple properties, it becomes interstate commerce disruption. That brings in federal marshals, not just territorial judges, not just Sheriff Hadley, federal authority that Briggs cannot buy or bully." They visited 3 more ranches that afternoon. Each told the same story. Fence cuts, missing livestock, mysterious accidents, veiled threats delivered by men who smiled while they spoke. Each rancher had been too afraid or too isolated to realize they were not alone. By sunset, Clara had compiled evidence spanning 6 months and 7 different properties. A dossier of destruction, a roadmap of one man's greed drawn in the suffering of his neighbors. She held the folder on the ride home like it was worth more than gold. Because it was. Gold could be stolen. Evidence could end empires. Caleb should have felt relief, hope, something positive. Instead, dread coiled in his stomach like a snake settling into a hole. Briggs is going to know, he said. The second we start asking questions, he will know, and he will retaliate. I know, damn it. Clara, this is not just cattle theft anymore. You are threatening his entire operation. Men like him, he struggled for words. Men like him do not stop at property crimes, she finished. I know that too. Her voice was quiet for a long moment. My father used to say that evil men count on good people being too afraid to act. They build their power on silence and isolation. And the moment someone breaks that silence, the whole structure becomes vulnerable. Your father was killed on a freight route, Caleb said quietly. Yes, by men like Briggs, by men exactly like Briggs. Her voice did not waver, which is why I know how important it is to fight them. Because if we do not, who will? And if no one ever does, they just keep taking until there is nothing left. She turned to him. In the fading light, her face was fierce and mild and certain all at once. I lost my father to men who thought they could intimidate anyone into submission. I will not lose this ranch the same way. She paused. I will not lose you the same way. Something cracked wide open in Caleb's chest. You said lose you, he heard himself say. Yes. That means you are staying. I already told you I was staying. She held his gaze. But you were not ready to believe it. She was right, and he was not sure he was ready now. But standing there on the trail with the sunset bleeding red across the mountains, and this woman looking at him with eyes that held no deception and no retreat, Caleb Shaw felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly. Something older, something stronger. Certainty. 3 nights later, the sky turned orange. Caleb woke to Clara shaking his shoulder, her voice urgent but controlled in the darkness. The hay barn, it is burning. He was moving before thought. Boots, coat. Through the window, flames licked the night sky 200 yards from the house. The old hay storage barn, their entire winter feed reserve. Turning to ash, they worked in desperate coordination, Josiah hauling buckets from the well, each one a useless prayer flung against an inferno. Bryce cutting fire breaks in the dry grass around the main barn, and House working with the cold precision of a man who understood that panic was a luxury they could not afford. Caleb fighting the blaze itself, getting close enough to blister, falling back, getting close again. And Clara, running between all of them, directing, thinking, seeing the whole battlefield while they each fought their corner. Move the horses to the far pasture, she shouted to Josiah. If the wind shifts, the main barn catches next. The wind will not. Move them. Now, Josiah moved them. The wind shifted 20 minutes later. If the horses had still been in the main barn, they would be dead. By the time the fire burned itself out, dawn was breaking gray and cold over ruins. The hay barn was gone. Every bit of winter feed with it. The horses were safe in the far pasture, but that was the only victory. Caleb stood in the ashes, calculating costs he could not afford, counting winter months he could not survive. We can prove it was arson. Clara appeared beside him, face streaked with soot, eyes red from smoke. In her hand, a piece of fabric oily smelling of kerosene. They soaked rags and threw them on the roof. Wanted it to look like an accident, but they got sloppy. She held up the fabric. This is evidence. Evidence Hadley will ignore. Then we go over his head. We take this directly to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, along with everything else. Josiah came toward them. His face was black with soot, and his eyes were red, and every muscle in his body was vibrating with a rage that had nowhere to go. I want to kill them, he said. His voice was raw, stripped of everything but truth. Clara stepped toward him, looked up at the man who was more than a foot taller than her and shaking with fury. I know, she said, simply, without judgment. The month is not over, Josiah said. and his voice cracked on the words breaking open to reveal something underneath the anger that was not anger at all. "But if you leave after this, I will not forgive you." It was the first time Josiah Shaw had admitted in his rough and graceless way that Clara's leaving would break something inside him that could not be repaired. Clara did not flinch, did not look away. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not for fires, not for cattle barons, not for anything." That night, after Josiah had collapsed into sleep in the main room, and Bryce had taken up his position on the porch rifle across his knees, watching the darkness with eyes that never seemed to close, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her body trembling, with an exhaustion she had refused to show until now. Caleb sat across from her, the lamplight between them, the smell of smoke and everything. "You could have died tonight," he said. "So could you." Silence. "Caleb." Her voice was smaller than he had ever heard it. "My father was killed by men like Briggs, men who thought they could burn anyone into silence." She looked at her hands, at the soot under her nails. "I did not come here to find another grave, but I did not come here to run either." "I know." "Do you?" She looked up. "Because every time I think you are starting to believe me, I see it in your eyes. The waiting, the preparing for me to disappear." Caleb reached across the table. Palm up, the same gesture as before. And just like before, Clara placed her hand in his. But this time she squeezed. Hard. Like she was holding on to something she was afraid the wind would take. "I am not Della," she whispered. The name hit him like a physical blow. He had never told her that name. But of course she knew. She read land and she read people, and a woman who could map 7 ranches worth of criminal conspiracy in 2 weeks could certainly read the ghost that lived in a man's eyes. "I know," he said. "Then stop waiting for me to become her." Outside on the porch, Bryce sat in the dark and listened to every word through the thin wall. His hand rested on the rifle stock. His eyes watched the horizon. But his mind was in that kitchen where a woman who was braver than anyone he had ever met was asking his brother to do the one thing that frightened Caleb Shaw more than fire or bullets or ruin: to trust. Bryce understood, because trust was the thing he struggled with too. Not the trust of brothers, which was built into his bones, but the trust of someone new, someone who could see things the way he saw them, someone who walked through the world noticing what others missed. He had felt it on the ridge when he put his hand on her arm and she did not flinch. He had felt it every day since watching her work, watching her think, watching her refuse to break. But she had chosen Caleb, or rather, she was choosing this family, this ranch, this fight, and Caleb was the door she had to walk through to get there. And Bryce Shaw, who understood sacrifice the way he understood tracking, who could read the shape of what was needed even when it cost him, would not stand in that doorway. He would stand on the porch, with a rifle, watching the dark, making sure nothing came through the night to take away the thing his brother was finally learning to hold. It was enough. It had to be enough. 3 days later, they rode for Cheyenne, Claire and Caleb in the wagon, Bryce on horseback, Walt Greer and 2 other ranchers who had agreed to testify following behind their faces, grim with the determination of men who had been afraid for too long and had finally found something stronger than fear. Josiah stayed behind to guard the ranch, armed to the teeth and vibrating with the particular energy of a man who desperately wanted someone to give him an excuse. They had left at dawn. By the time they reached the territorial office in Cheyenne, the sun was high and Claire had reviewed the evidence folder twice, checking every date, every detail, every connection. U.S. Marshal Hollis Ward was a man of 50, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He listened to their case for 4 straight hours, examined every piece of evidence, questioned every witness, made careful notes in a leather-bound ledger. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and said one word: "Ito." Finally, Caleb blinked. "We have been watching Briggs for months, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to bring us something concrete." Ward tapped the folder. "This is concrete. This is actionable. And this just became a federal investigation." Walking out of that office, Clara's hand found Caleb's and squeezed once hard. They had done it, but they had not, because Harlan Briggs had lawyers. Good ones. Fast ones. Lawyers from Cheyenne who rode through the night and found a procedural error in the arrest warrant before the ink was dry. A judge named Albert Redman, who sat behind a bench in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and older corruption, ruled the warrant invalid. Jurisdictional technicality. Federal statute cited in a territorial case. The wrong legal framework applied to the right evidence. Briggs walked free. Caleb received the news in Marshal Ward's office. His fist hit the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Ward's face was rigid with controlled fury. His lawyers are picking apart every piece of evidence, claiming it was gathered under an invalid warrant, fruit of the poisonous tree. That is insane, Caleb said. We have confessions, witnesses. We have confessions obtained under a warrant that a judge just declared void. Ward stood. I am keeping the investigation open. I have sent word to the Territorial Attorney General. We can get a new warrant, redo the arrest, but that takes time. And in the meantime, Briggs is free. How long? Week, maybe two. A week, 2 weeks of Briggs free and planning and furious. Clara, who had been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. The judge, Redman, he cited a federal statute that does not apply to territorial jurisdictions. The Marshals Commission explicitly grants authority in cases of interstate commerce disruption. Cattle rustling across county lines qualifies. Ward looked at her. How do you know territorial law? My father dealt with territorial courts constantly. Freight disputes, contract violations, theft claims. She met his eyes. This ruling is wrong. The judge either does not know the law or he is being paid not to know it. Ward studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Wire the Attorney General directly. Lay out the legal errors. If we can get Redman's ruling overturned before Briggs's lawyers bury us in motions, I will write it tonight, Clara said. She did. Sitting in the boarding house in Cheyenne by candlelight, while Caleb paced and Bryce sat motionless by the window, she composed a wire to the Territorial Attorney General's office that laid out the legal errors in Judge Redman's ruling with the precision of a surgical instrument. Every citation checked, every precedent confirmed, every logical flaw exposed. The response came the next morning. The Attorney General's office was reviewing the case. Judge Redman was under investigation. A new arrest warrant would be issued within 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 days. An eternity for a desperate man with nothing left to lose. And Briggs was desperate now. Clara knew it the way she knew weather, by reading signs that other people walked past without seeing. The hired guns that appeared in Elkhorn the next afternoon, 3 strangers on horseback with hard eyes and new pistols, confirmed it. Clara faced them from the balcony of the general store where she had gone to send a second wire. No weapon, no brothers flanking her, just her voice. You can state your business like civilized men, she called down to the street, or you can explain to a judge why you threaten violence in a public thoroughfare. Either way, I am certain the Territorial Attorney General's office will find your testimony fascinating. Behind the riders, Marshal Ward and his deputies materialized from doorways and alleys, positioning themselves with the quiet competence of men who had done this before. 2 of the 3 riders were arrested before they reached the edge of town. The third escaped, but his name was known within the hour. Briggs had made another mistake, and mistakes were what Clara Whitmore collected the way other women collected flowers. But the mistake that mattered most, the one that would crack the whole thing open, came not from Briggs himself, but from a woman named Margaret Cobb, who lived in a small house on the edge of Briggs's property with 3 children under 6, and a husband who came home later every night with blood on his hands and terror in his eyes. Clara rode to that house alone. Caleb did not know. Bryce did not know. Josiah back at the ranch definitely did not know, because if Josiah Shaw had known that Clara was riding alone to the home of the man who had led 3 armed riders onto their property, the resulting explosion would have been visible from 3 counties. Margaret Cobb opened the door to find a small woman in a dusty blue dress standing on her porch. My name is Clara Whitmore, Clara said. I think your husband is going to be doing what Harlan Briggs is telling him to do, and I think you know it. Margaret Cobb burst into tears. They sat at the kitchen table. 2 women, 2 cups of coffee going cold. 3 children playing in the next room, oblivious to the fact that their mother was about to change the course of a dozen lives. Margaret pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. She had found it in Levi's coat 2 weeks ago. A crude map of the Shaw Ranch, handwritten notes in the margins. Hay barn north side easy access. House blind approach from creek. Cattle pens weak locks. Clara unfolded it with steady hands. This is a planning document, she said, for raids, for the fire. Levi's handwriting, Margaret confirmed. He tried to burn it the night your barn went up, but I had already copied it. Why bang? Margaret's tears had stopped. In their place was something harder, something that had been building for months under layers of fear. Because I have 3 children, because my husband is going to end up dead or in prison, because someone has to make this stop. She looked at Clara across the table. And because you are the first person who came to my door and told me the truth instead of a lie. Clara reached across the table and took Margaret's hands. I will help you, she said, but I need you to testify. Margaret's hands shook, but they did not pull away. Yes, she said, God help me, yes. Clara rode home with the map folded in her pocket like a live coal, arriving at the ranch just as dusk turned the mountains purple. Caleb was on the porch. He saw her coming alone from the direction of Briggs's land, and his face went through 7 emotions in 3 seconds, none of them pleasant. She dismounted. He was beside her before her boots hit the ground, his hands on her arms, his eyes searching her face. Where were you? Getting us the evidence we need to end this. She showed him the map, watched his face as he read it, watched the color drain, then return darker than before. This ties Cobb directly to the fire, he said, and Cobb takes orders directly from Briggs. Margaret will testify. Combined with the other evidence, this is enough. She swayed slightly. The exhaustion of the day, the miles, the risk, the emotional weight of sitting across from a frightened woman and asking her to be brave, all of it hitting at once. Caleb's hands were still on her arms. And Clara, who had not allowed anyone to touch her for 22 years, who had built walls of competence and independence as high and thick as fortress stone, leaned into him. Just for a moment, just 1 second of letting someone else bear the weight. Then she straightened, stepped back, looked him in the eye. But Caleb had felt it, that 1 second of surrender. That one moment when the strongest woman he had ever known and admitted through the smallest possible gesture that she trusted him enough to be weak. It was worth more than any word she could have said. That night, Josiah met them at the door with news that turned the blood cold. Fresh tracks around the perimeter of the ranch, more than before. Different horses. Briggs was concentrating men. He is not going to wait for the warrant, Clara said. He is going to hit us before the system catches up with him. She spread her notes on the table, Caleb on one side, Josiah on the other. Bryce at the head, silent as stone, seeing everything. We have 48 hours, she said. Maybe less. He is panicking. Panicking men are dangerous, but they are also sloppy. He sent hired guns to town in broad daylight. He is concentrating riders where we can see the tracks. He is not thinking anymore. He is reacting. She looked at each of them in turn. 3 identical faces. 3 different storms raging behind the same amber eyes. We prepare. Because when he comes, and he is coming, we need to be ready. They worked through the night, reinforcing locks, clearing sight lines, loading weapons, moving supplies closer to the house. Bryce mapped every approach, every blind spot, every advantage the terrain offered. Josiah fortified the doors and shuttered the windows with planks thick enough to stop a rifle round. Caleb coordinated it all, his fear for Clara transmuted into action, into preparation, into the only language he had ever been fluent in. And Clara, moving between them with her notebook and her Winchester, directed the defense of their home with the same cold clarity she brought to everything else. Because this was not the first time she had prepared for an attack. Freight stations got raided. You learned to think like the raiders or you lost everything. Her father had taught her that. And now she would use it to protect the family he never got to meet. By midnight, the ranch was as ready as it would ever be. They sat at the kitchen table in silence. 4 cups of coffee, 4 exhausted faces. The wind outside picking up, carrying the smell of autumn and the distant promise of winter. Could be tonight, Caleb said. Could be, Clara agreed. Could be tomorrow, Josiah said. Could be he runs instead of fights. He will not run, Clara said. Not yet. He has too much pride. He will want to make a statement first. Bryce spoke for the first time in hours. 2 words that settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. We are ready. And they were. Whatever came through the dark, Whatever Briggs sent or brought or burned, 4 people sat in that kitchen who had chosen each other, chosen this land, chosen this fight. Not because it was safe, not because they were certain of winning, because it was right. And sometimes for people like them, that was enough. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie. Somewhere on Briggs' land, men were saddling horses. Somewhere in Cheyenne, a warrant was being drafted. Somewhere in a small house on the edge of darkness, Margaret Cobb was holding her children and praying she had done the right thing. And inside the Shaw Ranch, a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to find a place where she mattered more than her face set, surrounded by 3 men who had finally stopped seeing her beauty and started seeing her. The storm was coming, but they would not face it alone. They came 2 nights later. Caleb woke to the sound of breaking glass. Not a large sound, not dramatic, just the quiet pop of a window pane giving way to something hard thrown from outside, and then the whisper of cold October air rushing in through the gap. He was rolling out of bed before his eyes were fully open, hand closing around the rifle propped against the wall, feet finding boots in the dark, with the muscle memory of a man who had been preparing for this moment for days, for years, for his entire life maybe. Beside his door, a shadow moved. Clara, already up, already armed. The Winchester held low and ready, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale in the thin moonlight that came through the cracked window. "How many?" she whispered. Caleb moved to the window. Outside, in the silver wash of a 3/4 moon, riders circled the house. Not fast, not charging, just circling, slow and deliberate like wolves testing the edges of a campfire's light. He counted 5. From the hallway, Josiah appeared, shirtless, barefoot, holding his pistol in one hand and the 6-pound forge hammer in the other, because Josiah Shaw had never met a problem he did not believe could be solved with both a weapon and a blunt instrument. His face was calm. That was the dangerous thing about Josiah. When he was angry, he shouted. When he was calm, people got hurt. Bryce materialized from nowhere as he always did, rifle in hand, already moving toward the back door. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes met Caleb's and transmitted everything. Back covered, sightlines clear, ready. One of the riders called out, "Shaw, come out and talk." Caleb recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, the sheriff's cousin, one of Briggs's known associates, a man who straddled the line between lawful and criminal with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life. "About what?" Caleb shouted back. "About your testimony. About that woman's meddling. About calling off this whole investigation before people get hurt." "People already got hurt. My barn is ashes. My cattle are stolen." "And that is unfortunate." Morrison sounded almost sympathetic, almost human. "But pushing this investigation, making Cobb testify, that is going to make things much worse. Mr. Briggs is willing to compensate you. Pay for your losses. Fair price. All you have to do is withdraw the complaint and convince Cobb's wife to keep quiet." Clara's jaw tightened in the dark. Caleb felt it more than saw it, the shift in the air beside him, the temperature dropping by degrees. "Not interested," Caleb called. "Then you are making a mistake." The sympathy vanished from Morrison's voice like water evaporating off a hot stone. "Last chance, Shaw. Take the money. Walk away." "Go to hell." The riders went still. 5 dark shapes on 5 dark horses, motionless in the moonlight. Then Morrison turned his horse. "Your funeral," he said. They started riding away. And for one foolish, desperate second, Caleb thought that was it. Intimidation delivered. Message sent. Over. Then he smelled kerosene, not from the house, from the main barn. 3 points of orange light bloomed simultaneously against the dark wall of the building, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the flames caught the dry timber and climbed. You have already seen what happened next. You saw it at the very beginning of this story, the cold open that started with fire and ended with a confession. But what you did not see was what happened inside Clara's mind in the 3 seconds between the moment she realized the barn was burning and the moment she ran toward it. She thought about her father, not the freight routes or the business or the way he taught her to read land and count cattle and spot a liar from 50 yards. She thought about the night he died, about the fire they said killed him, about the men who said it and called it an accident and walked away free because no one was brave enough or stupid enough to stand up and say what everyone knew. She thought about that, and then she picked up her Winchester, set it by the water trough, and ran into a burning barn to save 3 horses and a man she had known for 21 days. Because some choices are not about thinking. They are about knowing who you are. And Clara Whitmore knew exactly who she was. She was the woman who ran toward fire. What followed was chaos and courage in equal measure. Caleb fighting the arsonist in the smoke. Josiah hauling horses through inferno, one after another, his massive arms working against raw animal terror. Bryce on the roof of the house rifle cracking the night sky, scattering the remaining riders with the precision of a man who could thread a needle at 200 yards. And Clara pulling Caleb through the smoke toward the last trapped horse because she had mapped every beam and stall of that barn in the 2 weeks since she arrived, and even blind, even choking, even with the roof groaning above her, she knew where she was going. They got the last horse out together. The roof came down behind them like the closing of a fist. They hit the dirt hard and lay there gasping alive by the thinnest margin God allows. And when Caleb looked at Clara in the orange light of everything burning, he saw not beauty, not fragility, not the woman the agency had sent to manage his household. He saw the person he was going to spend the rest of his life beside, whether they had a barn or not, whether they won or lost, whether the world burned down around them or bloomed green forever. Her, the arsonist's confession came after bleeding in the dirt with 12 witnesses standing over him and Clara's Winchester resting against the back of his skull. Briggs paid for all of it, and this time there was no invalid warrant, no corrupt judge to hide behind, just truth spoken under open sky. Marshal Hollis Ward arrived before dawn, riding hard drawn by the glow visible from 20 miles away. He took one look at the scene, the smoldering ruins, the bleeding arsonist in chains fashioned from Josiah's forge, the crowd of witnesses. The evidence folder Clara placed in his hands with fingers that were blistered but did not shake. "I need Cobb," Ward said. "His wife will bring him in," Clara replied. "I spoke with her. She is ready." Cobb broke that night, gave Ward everything: names, dates, payments, orders, every fence cut, every cattle theft, every fire. All of it traced back to Harlan Briggs, who had orchestrated a systematic campaign to force every small rancher in the valley off their land so he and his railroad partners could claim the water rights and the grazing territory in the future of Shadow Creek. Judge Albert Redmond's name appeared 17 times in Cobb's testimony. Payments confirmed, favors documented. A corrupt judge who had sold his oath for Briggs' money and who was now, according to Ward's contacts in Cheyenne, being escorted from his chambers by territorial marshals. It was over. Except it was not. Because Harlan Briggs did not wait for the second warrant, did not wait for the marshals who were already riding toward his ranch with chains and charges and the full weight of federal authority. He ran. Midnight. 4 horses, 3 men loyal enough or stupid enough to follow him into the dark. And before he left, one final act of spite so enormous that it defied reason. He set fire to the north fence line of Shawland. Not the buildings this time. The grass, the dry autumn prairie grass that had not seen rain in 3 weeks, that stretched from Shawland to Greerland to Hendersonland to the edge of the mountains. Grass that burned fast and hot and unstoppable, driven by wind that seemed to rise from nowhere as if the land itself were exhaling. Caleb smelled it before he saw it. Standing on the porch in the pre-dawn dark, still awake because sleep was impossible, still watching the horizon because watching was all he could do. The smell hit him first, then the glow, a line of orange on the northern horizon growing wider by the second. "Clara," his voice was calm, the calm that comes after you have already been afraid of everything and discovered that the worst thing is not fire or loss or pain. The worst thing is standing still. She was beside him in seconds. Bryce behind her, Josiah already pulling on boots. "The north pasture," Caleb said. "It is burning, and if it reaches Greer's place, it takes the whole valley." Clara stood very still for 1 heartbeat, 2. Then she turned to the men behind her with eyes that held no panic, only the cold, fierce clarity of a mind that had been built for crisis. "Wake everyone, every hand, every shovel, every bucket, now." They wrote out screaming warnings. Within 20 minutes, every able-bodied person within 3 miles was heading for the fire line. Old Walt Greer with his bad knees and his terrified eyes. The Henderson family, all six of them carrying every tool they owned. Emmett Prescott, for once deadly serious. Alma Finch, 70 years old and carrying a shovel like a weapon, because that is what it was. Even Sheriff Virgil Hadley showed up, and whatever failings the man had, whatever cowardice lived in his bones tonight, he dug alongside everyone else without complaint. The fire was a living thing. It had a voice, a deep crackling roar that swallowed every other sound. It had a speed moving across the dry grass faster than a man could run. It had an appetite that seemed to grow with every acre it consumed, as if each new stretch of fuel made it hungrier, angrier, more determined to devour everything between the mountains and the sky. They dug fire breaks in the dark. Caleb and Josiah side by side, shovels biting into earth that fought back. Bryce 50 yards down the line, working alone with the mechanical precision of a machine, never slowing, never stopping, never speaking. Walt Greer on his knees in the dirt, digging with his hands because his shovel had broken, and he refused to stop. It was not enough. "It is moving too fast," Walt shouted over the roar. "The brake will not hold." He was right. The fire was outrunning them. In minutes it would jump the brake, continue south, devour Walt's ranch, then the Hendersons, then the next and the next, until half the valley was ash and memory. Then hoofbeats, fast, from the south. Clara on horseback, riding like the devil himself, was behind her, her hair loose and streaming, and her face lit orange by the approaching flames. "The creek," she shouted, nearly falling from the saddle. "The irrigation ditches. If we extend them 50 yards to connect with the creek bed, we can flood a water barrier across the fire line." "The ditches do not reach this far," Josiah bellowed. "Then we dig them further. 50 yards, 20 minutes, we can do it." 20 minutes, with a wall of flame bearing down on them, with exhaustion turning their muscles to water and their lungs to leather. 50 yards of trench between them and total destruction. Impossible, their only chance. Josiah looked at Clara, looked at the fire, looked at his brothers, then turned to the line of exhausted, terrified, determined people, stretching out on either side of him, every one of them there because of a woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago and refused to let them be afraid alone. "You heard her," Josiah roared, his voice carried above the fire, above the wind, above everything. Dig, they dug. Every man and woman and child capable of holding a shovel tore at the earth with everything they had. Caleb dug beside Clara. Their shovels struck ground in rhythm, side by side, two people moving as one. Josiah dug like three men, his massive arms driving the shovel deep on every stroke. His face set in an expression that said the fire could come, and the fire could burn, and the fire could rage. All it wanted, but it would not take this valley while Josiah Shaw still had hands. Bryce dug at the far end of the trench alone, silent, unstoppable. He did not look up, did not check progress, did not waste a single ounce of energy on anything except the next shovelful of earth. Because Bryce Shaw understood better than anyone that survival was not about grand gestures. It was about one more shovelful, and then one more, and then one more after that. Alma Finch dug. 70 years old, arthritic hands. A woman who had predicted Clara's failure from the stagecoach platform. She dug until her shovel snapped, then grabbed a broken fence post and used that. The fire came closer. 50 feet, 40. The heat was a physical force now pushing against their bodies, drying the sweat on their skin before it could form. 30 feet. Caleb could feel his skin blistering, could smell cloth beginning to singe, could hear someone praying behind him, the words lost in the roar. 20 feet. Then Clara's shovel broke through. She hit the creek bed at the bottom of the trench, and water came rushing in, not a flood, not a torrent, just a thin brown stream that filled the ditch and spread along the channel they had carved through the earth. Muddy, shallow, pathetic against the monster bearing down on them. But enough. The fire hit the water barrier and slowed, not stopped. Fire does not stop for anything short of God, but slowed the way a running man slows when he hits mud, losing momentum, losing fury. And in that slowing, they gained time. Time to widen the barrier, deepen it, reinforce it with wet earth and exhausted hands and prayers that maybe, just maybe, this thin line of water would hold. It held. Dawn came gray and cold over a landscape that looked like the surface of another world. Black earth stretching to the horizon, smoke rising in thin columns from 1,000 small fires that would burn themselves out by noon. The air tasted of ash and char and something else, something clean, something that might have been rain coming, or might have been relief, or might have been nothing more than the absence of flames. They collapsed where they stood, every one of them, dropped to the scorched ground like puppets, with their strings cut, too exhausted to move, too alive to sleep, too stunned by what they had done to fully believe they had done it. Clara lay in the black dirt between the Shaw brothers. Her left hand was in Caleb's. His fingers closed around hers, soot-covered and bleeding and shaking, and he did not let go. Her right shoulder pressed against Bryce, who sat beside her, and for one moment so brief that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it, Bryce reached out and touched her hair, light as air, gentle as snow falling. Then his hand withdrew and his eyes turned to the horizon, and whatever he felt was folded away into the quiet place where Bryce Shaw kept the things that belonged to no one but himself. Josiah sat behind all three of them, his back against a charred fence post, his massive frame positioned between his family and whatever might still come out of the dark. Even now, even after the fire was out and the enemy was gone, even when the only threat remaining was the cold and the exhaustion and the long walk home, Josiah Shaw placed himself between the people he loved and the world, because that was what Josiah Shaw did, and he would do it until the day he died. Walt Greer staggered over. His face was black. His clothes were smoking in three places. His eyes were wet. "My ranch is standing," he said, his voice cracked like dry wood. "Because of you people. My ranch is still standing." From behind him, other voices. The Hendersons, Emmett Prescott, neighbors who had fought beside them in the dark, all of them looking at the Shaw family in the ash, seeing what Alma Finch had seen at the stagecoach station and gotten wrong. Not a pretty girl who would run, a woman who had saved them all. The hoofprints told the rest of the story. Bryce found them in the ash at dawn, leading away from the point of ignition. 4 horses heading south. Briggs's final signature written in fire. Marshal Ward found Briggs 3 days later, or found what was left of the man, 50 miles south in a ravine where the trail narrowed to a thread between 2 walls of rock. His horse had stumbled in the dark, thrown him, broken his neck. Dead before his companions could reach him if they even tried. 2 of the 3 men with him were captured within the week. The third drowned crossing a flooded river, running from a chase that was already over. But here is the thing that Clara noticed and that no one else did not right away. Among Briggs's belongings recovered from his saddlebag by Ward's deputies was a letter, partially written, never sent, addressed to 2 men in Denver whose names appeared in the railroad company records that Clara had pulled from the county clerk's office in Elkhorn. The letter outlined plans, not for Shadow Creek alone, for the entire northern Wyoming territory, land acquisitions, water rights, railroad easements, a scheme so large that Briggs, for all his power, was merely the hand that did the work. The brain, the money, the true architecture of destruction sat in offices 200 miles away, wearing fine suits and drinking imported whiskey and moving families off their land with the casual efficiency of men sweeping crumbs from a tablecloth. "It is not over," Clara said when Ward showed her the letter. "No," Ward agreed, "it is not. But it is over for now." "Yes, for now it is." Clara folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "You will need this for what comes next." Ward looked at her, at this young woman in her dusty dress with her blistered hands and her eyes that saw too much and understood even more. "Miss Whitmore, you should consider studying law." "I am studying something better," Clara said. "I am studying this valley, and I intend to make sure no one takes it again." The days that followed had a different quality, slower, quieter, like the valley itself was exhaling after holding its breath for months. The air smelled of ash and new lumber, and the first cold edge of approaching winter. The barn raising resumed. Every rancher in Shadow Creek showed up. Walt Greer brought timber from his own stock. The Hendersons hauled nails by the barrel. Emmett Prescott, who turned out to be a surprisingly competent carpenter, when he was not busy being the valley's most persistent flirt, worked 14 hours straight without complaint. Alma Finch arrived with enough food to feed an army and a look on her face that dared anyone to comment on the fact that she was also carrying a hammer. She found Clara by the well-filling water buckets for the workers. "I was wrong about you," Alma said. Clara looked up. "Wrong about what you could handle, wrong about you leaving, Wrong about everything I said at that stagecoach station. The old woman's voice was rough, but her eyes were clear. I'm sorry. Clara smiled. Not the guarded, strategic smile she had worn during confrontations with Cobb and Hadley and Morrison. A real one, small and warm and genuine. Thank you, Alma. The old woman nodded once briskly, then turned to the barn raising and began shouting instructions at men twice her size with the confident authority of someone who had been building things since before most of them were born. The barn went up in 12 days. 12 days of hammers and saws in the particular kind of laughter that comes from shared labor after shared suffering. When the last board was nailed and the last beam was raised, Caleb stood in the wide doorway of the new barn and breathed in the smell of fresh pine and thought about what it meant. Not just a building, a statement. This community, this valley, these people, they had been through fire in every sense of the word, and they were still standing. Clara appeared beside him. She always appeared beside him now. Not because she needed to be near him, but because nearness had become natural, the way breathing was natural, something the body did without being asked. It is beautiful, she said. It is a barn. It is more than that. It is proof. She slipped her hand into his. Proof that what we built here matters. Your month ended 4 days ago. She said it that evening. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, wrapped in the same blanket because the nights were getting cold, and neither of them wanted to be the one to go inside for a second blanket when sharing one was warmer. Caleb had known, had been trying not to think about it, had been counting days in his head and then deliberately losing count because counting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant facing the question that he had been running from since the stagecoach. And yet you are still here, he said, and yet I am still here. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to face him. Her eyes in the fading light were darker than daylight deeper. Do you want me to be? She asked. His heart hammered against his ribs. Clara, because if this is still a trial, if you are still waiting for me to leave, I need to know. I need to know if what I feel is. He kissed her. It was not planned, not strategic, not the careful, measured approach that Clara Whitmore brought to everything else in her life. He simply turned toward her and put his hands on her face gently, the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking, and kissed her. Soft, brief, the barest brush of his lips against hers. Then he pulled back, his hand still on her face, her eyes wide, her breath caught. Stay, he said. The word came out rough, scraped raw by 7 years of silence. Not for a month, not for a trial. Stay because this is your home. Because I need you. Because my brothers need you. Because this whole valley needs you. His voice cracked. Because I love you. And I should have said it weeks ago, but I was afraid, and I am still afraid, and I am saying it anyway because you taught me that being afraid is not a reason to be silent. Clara's eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, with something fiercer, something that had been building since the moment she stepped off a stagecoach and refused to be anyone other than who she was. I love you too, she said, since the night you put your hand on the table and let it shake. Since you showed me that strength does not mean pretending you are not afraid. She kissed him this time, firmer, a promise. When they broke apart, he held her against him, and she let herself be held, and the mountains turned purple in the last light. And somewhere inside the house, Josiah was pretending very loudly that he had not been watching through the kitchen window, while Bryce sat on the far end of the porch in the gathering dark and smiled at nothing and everything. The wedding was not Clara's idea. It was Josiah's. He brought it up 3 days after the proposal, standing in the new barn with sawdust in his hair and a look on his face that dared anyone to comment on the fact that his eyes were suspiciously bright. You are getting married in this barn, he said to Caleb, while the church, not the town hall, here, where she proved she belonged, where we became a family. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. Here, they said at the same time, and Josiah grinned so wide it nearly broke his face. The morning of the wedding, Clara stood in Alma Finch's spare room and looked at the dress the seamstress had delivered. It was beautiful, lace and satin and everything a bride was supposed to be. Everything Clara had never wanted. It is lovely, Alma said carefully. It is a costume. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. This is not me. Alma closed the door, sat down, studied the young woman who had faced down gunmen and cattle barons, and wildfire without flinching, and who now stood paralyzed by a piece of clothing. When I married Thomas 43 years ago, Alma said, they put me in a dress just like that, told me to be proper, be delicate, be quiet, let the men handle everything. She paused. I hated every second. Then why? Because I thought that was what marriage required. Alma stood, walked to her wardrobe. But you already showed this valley who you are. Caleb is not marrying a decoration. He is marrying the woman who stood in the ashes and refused to break. 20 minutes later, Clara looked at her reflection and recognized herself. Simple dress, practical, elegant in its straightforwardness. Her mother's silver necklace, hair pulled back the way she wore it when working, boots instead of delicate shoes. She looked like the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach and demanded to be seen for who she was. Perfect, Alma said. Now let us get you married. The barn smelled of new pine and possibility. Half the valley was inside packed shoulder to shoulder on rough benches and overturned crates, and anything else that could hold a human being in an upright position. Walt Greer sat in the front row openly weeping before the ceremony even started. The Hendersons had brought wildflowers. Emmett Prescott had somehow acquired a fiddle and was playing something that might have been a wedding march if you were generous about definitions. The territorial judge who had come to oversee Briggs's estate settlement agreed to perform the ceremony. He seemed genuinely pleased to do something that did not involve criminal charges. Caleb stood at the front of the barn in his best shirt cleaned and pressed his hair combed back. Josiah on his right standing straight for the first time in memory, a grin threatening to split his face. Bryce on his left, silent, steady present. Then Claire entered the barn, and Caleb Shaw, who had survived loss and 7 years of emptiness, who had built a ranch with his hands and defended it with his blood, who had fought men and fire, and the slow grinding despair of believing that no one would ever stay, looked at the woman walking toward him and felt something settle inside his chest. Not excitement, not nervousness, something deeper. Home. She walked to him without hesitation, took his hands, looked up into his face because she always had to look up, and that was all right, because the distance between their heights had stopped mattering the moment she started standing taller than anyone in the room. You came, he said quietly. Did you think I would not? Part of me, the scared part. His hands tightened around hers. Not anymore. The vows were traditional, but when Caleb spoke them, they carried weight that went beyond ceremony. I promised to stand with you, to trust you, to build something real that lasts. And when Claire responded, her voice steady and clear, every person in that barn understood that they were witnessing not just a wedding, but the ending of a story that had begun with a man who was afraid to hope and a woman who refused to let him stop. I promised to stay, to fight beside you, to never let you face anything alone again. Finally, Josiah bellowed before the judge could finish the pronouncement, and the barn erupted in laughter and then in cheers as Caleb kissed his bride gentle and certain while the new rafters shook with the sound of a community that had survived fire and came out the other side together. That evening, while the celebration swirled around them, Clara found herself standing at the barn door looking out at the valley, the mountains, the sky turning colors she did not have names for. Bryce appeared beside her. He was quieter than quiet, which meant something was on his mind that cost him to carry. You changed this place, he said. 3 words, from a man who weighed words like gold. We changed it, Clara said, silence. The kind that Bryce was comfortable in, and most people were not. Thank you for staying, he said. Clara looked at him, at this man who was identical to his brothers in every physical way and utterly different in every way that mattered, who had seen her clearly from the very first moment, not her face but her hands, not her beauty but her competence, who had walked beside her through danger and planning and the slow building of trust, and who had never once tried to stand in front of her when she was perfectly capable of standing for herself. Thank you for seeing me, she said, from the beginning, when you looked at my hands instead of my face at the stagecoach station. Bryce held her gaze, longer than he had held anyone's, and in his eyes Clara saw everything he would never say, not because he lacked the words, but because some truths are too large for language, and some loves are expressed not in what you reach for, but in what you release. He nodded. Once. Then he walked away. And Clara watched him go, and she understood, and her heart ached with a sweetness she had not known was possible, because she had come to Wyoming looking for one man and found three. And the one who stood at the edge of everything watching, protecting, seeing her more clearly than anyone ever had, was the one who had chosen to let her go. Not because he did not feel, but because he loved his brother. And that was a kind of courage that no one would ever write a story about, but that mattered more than any heroic act she had ever witnessed. Josiah found her next. He filled the doorway with his shoulders and his grin, in the particular energy of a man who had just consumed an inadvisable amount of whiskey and discovered that it made him philosophical. You coming inside or what? Emmett is trying to tell jokes and someone needs to save us. Clara laughed. Coming. Good. He paused, shifted his weight. For a moment, the grin faded into something real. Thank you. For what? For giving my brother a reason to smile again. He hesitated. And for giving me a reason not to hit anyone for 3 months straight. Personal record. Clara was still laughing when she walked back inside to find her husband, who was standing exactly where she had left him, watching the door, waiting for her to come back through it. Because that was what Caleb Shaw did now. He waited for Clara, and she always came back. The first snow fell in November. Clara and Caleb stood on the porch wrapped in the same blanket, watching white silence descend on the valley they had saved. Inside, Josiah was cooking the sounds of his efforts, involving a concerning amount of clattering and at least 2 instances of profanity directed at a cast-iron skillet. Bryce sat by the window with a book, his eyes occasionally lifting to the porch. The corner of his mouth curved in something that was almost in the right light if you were feeling generous a smile. Ready for winter? Caleb asked. Feed stored, animals sheltered, firewood stacked, house weather-proofed. Clara ticked each item. Walt's cooperative supply system is working. Every ranch in the valley is buying bulk. Costs are down 12%. That is not what I meant. She looked at him. I meant us, you and me, ready to be snowed in for months with each other and my 2 brothers through thin walls. I survived cattle barons and arson and wildfire and a federal investigation. I think I can survive a winter with the Shaw brothers. Josiah snores. I know. Bryce already warned me. They laughed, quiet, natural. The laughter of 2 people who had walked through everything and arrived at a place that was not perfect, but was real, and real was better than perfect had ever been. Clara placed her hand on her stomach, lightly, almost unconsciously. Caleb noticed. He always noticed her now. Are you? Not sure, maybe. Next month we will know. He pulled her closer. The snow fell. And inside the house that they had defended together on the land they had fought for together, Caleb Shaw held his wife and felt something he had believed was dead for 7 years. Future. A real one. Not hoped for, not feared, just real. Growing under his hand like a heartbeat. Now. Before we end this, let me ask you something. When was the last time you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier? When was the last time you looked at something broken and saw not the damage but the possibility? When was the last time you trusted someone? Really trusted them, even though you had every reason in the world not to? Caleb Shaw spent 7 years waiting for everyone to leave. Then a woman stepped off a stagecoach and refused to become anyone other than who she was. She did not save him. She gave him a reason to save himself. She did not fix what was broken. She showed him that broken things could be rebuilt stronger than they were before. And 3 brothers who had been alone on a mountain learned that strength is not about how much you can carry by yourself. It is about who you let help you carry it. It is about the woman who sees your fear and does not look away. The brother who stands on the porch all night so you can sleep. The neighbor who brings timber after a fire. The old woman who was wrong and says so. That is what this story is about. Not love alone, not courage alone, not justice alone, but all of them together woven into something that no single thread could be. If this story meant something to you, take a second to hit that like button. It costs nothing and it helps more than you know. Share it with someone who is carrying something heavy and could use a reminder that they do not have to carry it alone. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I have got others, some wilder, some darker, All of them true in the ways that matter. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if there is someone in your life who reminds you of Clara or Caleb or Josiah or Bryce. I read every single one, and I mean that. Because here is the thing about stories. They do not end when the last word is spoken. They end when you carry them out of this room and into your life. When you look at the burned places in your own story and think maybe, just maybe, it is not too late to rebuild. It is not. It never was. And one honest choice, one moment of refusing to quit, one hand extended across a kitchen table in the dark, can turn a man who lost everything into a man who found what he did not know he was missing. All because a woman stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty frontier town and chose to stay. Some people wait their whole lives for that kind of courage. Do not be one of them.